pleasure and honor to be here with you all today. I'm just going to speak briefly because I'm really excited to get to your questions. Do I use this? So for the past 15 years, I've been a researcher and a designer studying the nature of innovation in learning environments. I started my career as a classroom teacher, spent 4 years being trained to be an educator, and got my own classroom, and was incredibly frustrated by how many things I couldn't do, but I was taught for the past 4 years were best practices. So I left the classroom pretty quickly, but most of my work now is about studying how do we totally transform what learning looks like. And that's included building learning technologies, studying very different types of learning environments, and building tools and frameworks and methods for helping schools totally redesign from the inside out. I'm going to mention that I work with a couple organizations in addition to Lumiar. I'm the co-founder of the Center for Curriculum Redesign, and I mention this for a couple of reasons. One, we're an international NGO where for the past 7 years we've been doing policy development and work with jurisdictions all around the world, helping them rethink what the curriculum might look like, and that includes working with the PISA and the OECD. And so you may have recently seen our document that helped unpack what the main competencies were in the new BNCC, and if you haven't seen that document, I really recommend checking it out. I also work with the OECD on a project called Education 2030, which is, again, a project looking at what should the curriculum be now to prepare our learners for the world in 2030. So there's a bunch of countries, a bunch of experts looking at what are the knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values, or the competencies that our learners need. And so the things that we talk about today, I hope, sit in the context of these larger global initiatives. I lead a project at MIT called the Learning Graph, which is attempting to help bring some cohesion to this whole picture. We talk a lot about competencies that are hard to put handles on, like ethical thinking. We want our kids to be ethical in their work, in their way, in participating in our societies and communities. But what is that? What does that look like to support learners to develop ethical thinking in the classroom? And there's many others: computational thinking, systems thinking, problem solving. We have loads of research that shows how critical these skills are, and yet they're sort of fuzzy concepts. So the Learning Graph helps bring some coherence and some tangible handles to what those frameworks might be. In this problem space, I look at traditional standards and how they're severely limiting to a lot of systems. So literally the way we design standards dictates what the day-to-day learning practices and pedagogies look like in the classroom. The standards limit innovation in learning technologies, so the way they're designed actually limits how we design really cutting-edge game-based learning environments, immersive digital technologies. Many of the things you see on the floor were often inhibited by the design and shape of standards. And right now, we have a broad range of change and innovation in education. You know, what should modern schools look like? We have some great examples, but certainly we have a long way to go to help to make that every learner's everyday experience. And so the questions that I design toward are, how do we design standards that actually support the type of learning, the how kids learn that we value? And what types of tools and supports are needed to make that happen? Oh, sorry, these are not coming through very nicely. But this is a standard from the US. It's hard to read, I apologize for that. But it's a long, drawn-out sentence that sort of incorporates a bunch of aspects into one sentence, and it makes it difficult to teach to. And I really like this quote that I think unpacks standards. It's a sequence of topics that skims the surface and misses the substance and even the form of a subject. The standard gives a goal, but does not characterize the knowledge and competencies needed to achieve that goal. And so we're starting to see new movement towards competencies. We see it in the BNCC, but how do we unpack the way they're written so that we're teaching towards the actual competencies themselves? We see in standards, this is again another example from the US, and I think it's a really great example that explains what we're actually teaching. This standard says verify experimentally properties of rotations, reflections, and translations. So this is an 8th grade geometry standard. But if you really unpack what you're teaching there, there's aspects of properties of rotations and reflections and translations, but verify experimentally is a whole competency in itself. How do you get learners to be doing work where they're building experiments, they're verifying what they're doing? That's a complex skill that we've just kind of stuck into that standard. And I would argue that if you walk in many classrooms in the US, you'll see teachers mostly worrying about kids generally getting the concept of properties of rotations, but not how to properly vet something in test experiments. So we see this movement globally right now, moving away from just domains like math, literacy, and science, and going to more these broader competencies that I mentioned before. And so as we start to think about these broader competency maps, we can start to think about these developmental progressions learners move on, and thinking about the zoomed out picture. Rather than teaching these very linear focused standards, how do we think about the broader development of our learners in these competencies? So I'm just going to end there because I want to make sure that we have enough time. So thank you very much.